One of the most commonly requested features in Pokemon fan projects is multiple regions. The ability to go on a second adventure just after you finished your last with the same team of Pokemon. But of course, that takes a lot of time. Creating one region with its own routes, towns, trainer teams, and even storylines is already enough work on its own, meaning most developers aren't willing to go the extra mile in an entirely free-to-play game. So when I saw the announcement for the completed release of a Pokemon fan game with 2 regions, I was a bit skeptical. Obviously, something like that isn't out of the question, but for such a big project, there weren't any teasers, social media posts, or really anything building up to the release of the game. And from what I could see in only the screenshots, it didn't look like a completely amateur project either, expressing a level of quality in the overworld design. So, what's the catch? Well, that's what I'm here to figure out today, with a review of the game's regions, story, exploration, and of course, gameplay, breaking down the best parts of each of those aspects, and providing constructive criticism for the things that didn't quite land. So without further ado, my name is Ari, and this is Pokemon Hydro Bliss. When you think of a Pokemon game with 2 regions, the first, and for some people, the only one that comes to mind, is Heart Gold and Soul Silver, a game where you travel across the small Johto region of 10 towns, complete its story, and then journey across the small Kanto region, also composed of 10 towns. So when you first open the region map in this game, you might think that you're looking at the whole world map. Yeah, that's not the case. This is just one region of around 25 towns, alongside another with what looks to be more than that. This game is a lot bigger than I originally thought, as rather than each of these regions being tiny with only 8 gyms, they're very sizable, with 18 gyms each. Now, understanding all this information, I'm sure you're once again thinking to yourself, what's the catch? How does a game with 2 massive regions just appear out of nowhere? Well, I'll get to that, but as always, I like to start with the positives. When you start the game, you'll actually be able to choose which of the 2 regions you'd like to play through first. The game does suggest you start with the Kosei region, which from my experience, I very much agree with. Once that decision is made, you'll load into a small town, receive a starter from the local professor, and immediately be able to begin your journey. An adventure that in no way forces you to do things in a certain order. That's right, this game is entirely open world. Upon reaching the second town, you can choose to go right or left, and upon reaching the next town, you'll once again have the choice between 2 branching paths. I've never been a huge fan of most open world fan games, specifically ROM hacks, but when it's done with a new region, I feel a lot more like there isn't any wrong way to go, compared to already knowing the intended game direction and feeling forced to follow it or diverge from it to a certain extent. On to my actual first compliment though, the maps in Hydro Bliss are surprisingly well done, and not in any way lazily put together. They have a lot of detail, of course being made with a custom tile set, stand out from one another with mostly unique layouts, and for the most part are pretty fun to explore. If you're wondering why that's a surprise, well, like I said before, a completed fan game with 2 regions doesn't just come out of nowhere. So I went in with realistic expectations that most of the game would be made in haste. However, I feel that these compliments really only apply to the recommended region. I don't think the other one has the lazy or rushed feeling I was originally worried about. It just feels more like the Haido region was constructed first as someone who is new to fan game development, and the recommended Kosei region was then created with the knowledge the developer gained afterwards, allowing it to look a lot better, which is something that is kind of visible within the other region, as the map quality does start to improve as you progress through it. The exploration of the 2 regions was easily my favorite part about the entire game, but most people do come to Pokemon fan projects with the desire of experiencing a new story, and I'm going to be completely honest, this game doesn't really have one. The story content that does exist is mostly, if not entirely, optional, and is often just taking down an organized group with their own individual goals. However, that might be a plus for some people, and I'm honestly leaning towards that as well. In an open world Pokemon game, it's kind of hard to have a single storyline with tons of events and cutscenes, as you aren't exactly playing the game in a set order. So I was honestly more of a fan that the story that did exist was instead optional and required me to actually search for it or ignore it entirely if I wanted nothing to do with it. With that said, I decided I won't be giving a score to the writing or the story, as I do feel it's a bit unfair when it's very, very far from the game's main focus. As fun as the world was to explore though, this is still a Pokemon game, and you're still going to be spending half the game battling others. So, to start, Hydro Bliss offers a roster of Pokemon from all 9 generations. But in 2025, that's not really a unique feature for a Pokemon fan game. What really helps diversify the battles in this game are the 300 new moves. While that might sound like an overwhelming number, most of them were more or less what I like to call filling in the blank type of moves. Attacks that are very similar to another, but with a different typing, accuracy, or even power level to balance them out. These new moves made for a much more engaging gameplay experience, encouraging me to even capture the Pokemon I've used in dozens of other playthroughs. Hydro Bliss also comes with 3 different difficulty modes. While I didn't give the lowest option a try, the normal mode was pretty balanced. Most bosses could be defeated by just bringing the correct type matchups, and only their ace ever really gave me problems. So after breezing through the game for a bit, I decided to give the intense mode a try, expecting a much more difficult experience. And I'll be honest, I don't think it lived up to the title of intense, but it was still much harder than the normal mode, and definitely a lot of fun. The main gimmick of the intense mode is that gym leaders will set up special effects on the field to give them an advantage. For example, the Bug-type gym leader will disable a random move of my Pokemon when it was swapped onto the field. That, alongside a Bug-type attack that shortly set up a Water Sport, forced me to come up with a strategy that didn't involve Fire types, but also one that didn't require a ridiculous amount of thinking. Like I said, I think the hardest difficulty is very fun, it just doesn't live up to its name, which is honestly more of a nitpick than anything else. So if you're someone who craves the same level of challenge in newer difficulty hacks, you might not enjoy this game as much. But if you want a balanced experience with a still engaging level of difficulty, then I think you'll still find that within this game. With such a massive world to explore and dozens of Pokemon to collect, you'll of course need some quality of life to help you navigate the game's insane amount of content. Luckily, the region is very easy to backtrack through, as after you obtain your first gym badge, you'll be given the HM for Fly. Speaking of HMs, not a single one of your Pokemon needs to be taught the move for it to work. As long as they're able to learn it, the HM can be used. Additionally, none of them are locked behind any story events you'd normally have to search for. All HMs can be obtained from any Pokemon if you have the required number of gym badges. Next, you'll have access to the Advanced Pokédex, which lets you view the learnable moves and stats of every Pokemon you've captured, making it easier to understand the crazy number of changes the game provides. And the last big one is that this game does also offer the EXP All, but it requires that you capture 100 unique Pokemon before receiving it. This isn't a system I entirely agree with, as I much prefer the item being immediately obtainable, if at all, but it's also not something I can look at as an objective flaw. However, you are able to at least receive the regular held item EXP share after only catching 5 unique Pokemon. I also never felt that there was a lack of trainers on any of the routes, so being underleveled isn't a problem I ever think you'll encounter. I have to admit, this game was a lot better than I thought it'd be. It was clearly developed over the course of a few years, with a lot of thought and care gone into it. The only real complaints I have is that there are a few bugs in the game, like following Pokemon refusing to work for a period of time after certain battles, or some of the custom moves not really working. Another big thing, though, is that the game's performance isn't the greatest, as it does run on an older version of Essentials. Other than that, though, I didn't encounter any issues that self-blocked me, crashed the game, or prevented me from continuing forward. And despite the game's completed tag, the developer is still working on ways to improve what's already there, with the feedback being provided in the game's Discord. So with my final scores on screen, and feel free to pause and read them, I will be giving the game a 7.3 out of 10. If you want to explore a massive new world with every Pokemon available, then I think Hydro Bliss is exactly what you're looking for. But anyways, thank you all for watching, thank you to my channel members for their continued support, and have a nice rest of your day.